threat actors are using AI like everyone else. They got a question, they need to do research, they're turning to Gemini and Claude and ChatGPT to ask it. Now, you may be asking it to plan your trip to Rome and make sure you hit all the hotspots. Well, they're asking it, what are the biggest potential targets? Who has the most money? Or what are who has the most market share in a particular area, so that they can think through how do they conduct their operations. And I think this started small with kind of initial queries by adversaries, but today it is part of their operations. And I think if you look at the recent threat intelligence reports by people like Google, looking at what they have actually found in Gemini or Anthropic and what they've found in terms of adversary use of Claude, is that it has gotten progressively sophisticated month after month after month. That the initial research that they were conducting using these tools, or ransomware actors using it to up-level their English skills by producing far better, more believable phishing emails, has transformed today to using it to create malware, to create AI agents that are actually part of C2 infrastructure, and all the way down to the more mundane North Korean IT workers. And I think this one was probably the most interesting. As North Korea kind of dramatically increased their scale of putting IT workers into US and overseas locations, largely to make money, but also potentially to give them access to preposition for future operations, they used to spend a lot of time training their North Korean IT workers to actually be able to do the engineering tasks that their supervisors were asking them. Fast forward to today, Anthropic's review of North Korean IT worker use of Claude found that their skills have largely evaporated, and they're putting far less sophisticated, far less trained North Korean IT workers in places, because now they're just using Claude to do the basic development work and code review that they previously had to train them to do. Now, again, I think as folks who are involved in this space know, those tools are not perfect. These people are being more easily discovered in this way. But I think it demonstrates that these tools are now here to stay, and that they are going to be part of every single attack that we see in the future. AI will play some role, whether it's involved in the phishing, whether it's involved in the research, whether it's involved in mining the data that people exfiltrate from networks. Every part of that, there is an opportunity to use AI, and I think that's what we're seeing adversaries do. Now, what this likely to mean is that you're going to see smaller groups, the less sophisticated groups, be able to upscale. And I think when you look at some of their most recent trends about what people are able to do using AI, today requires some degree of sophistication to do it. So good, competent security researchers today can actually work with AI, know how to construct the prompts appropriately, know how to do the back and forth to be able to identify zero-day vulnerabilities in code. That is happening today. Security researchers have proved it. Google developed an algorithm that allowed them to do it at scale on a number of applications. But that is happening from more sophisticated security researchers who know how to interact with the prompts to get them that result. But if we look forward 6 months or a year, the level of skill necessary to do that will begin to drop. The tools will be able to respond more intuitively to the questions, because in part they're being trained on all of the work that more sophisticated security researchers are now doing. We are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, that in one case, Anthropic in their August report released, their August threat intelligence report released, they talked through what an actor was able to do using AI and building a series of agents that allowed them to do every part of the cyber kill chain. Reconnaissance, malware development, command and control, data exfiltration, analysis on the data, ransom. Now again, the actor kind of knew what they were doing and also constructed the context for those agents appropriately, including telling the agent that it was, going back to where this conversation started, that it was a legitimate security researcher who had legitimate, allowed, and agreed to access to the network to perform the series of functions it was asking the agent to perform. Now, again, I think the frontier model companies are learning from these experiences on how to tune their detection to avoid this type of thing from happening again. But it is hard. If you are a legitimate security researcher, you're a legitimate pen tester with permission to attempt to access a network, the things that bad guys do should look no different than what a legitimate pen tester does, absent the agreement beforehand with the system owner. So it's not surprising that in some cases they were able to construct these agents in a way they got around it. The other issue is by making these agents smaller, more focused on individual tasks, it is easier to avoid the type of security and safety filters that the frontier model companies put in place. You're not starting from the beginning and asking the AI to conduct an attack and help me exfiltrate money. You're asking it a series of far smaller questions, which in and of themselves may not be that vulnerable, or may not be viewed as problematic. I need you to analyze a large series of data and help me understand which of this data is most important for a company like X. Or I need you to make sure that we maintain consistent pinging activity, that I can maintain consistent access to the following IP address throughout a series of network operations. In and of themselves, those types of prompts are far less likely to get caught and far more likely to be allowed to continue. I think that is what we're seeing. And then certainly when it comes to things like social engineering and ransomware, the ability to use modern AI systems to interact with people, break through language barriers, be more convincing, is just off the charts. And so not only that, but also as Google noted in some of their research, everyone involved in conducting information operations, disinformation, et cetera, they are all using AI as part of those operations today, every single one of them. Now, I think one of the areas where this could pose kind of the biggest challenge, when we think through what the cyber evolution has looked like over the past 5 to 10 years, where a lot of capabilities were very high-level capabilities started only with nation states. They eventually migrated to ransomware groups as those groups got more sophisticated, as they specialized, as you started looking at things like ransomware as a service, people who could actually do the right level of development and research were developing tools and then allowing those to be used by others on a pay-for-use or as part of an affiliate. That still limited the universe of people who could actually conduct these kind of operations. If we're looking down the road a year or two and far less sophisticated actors could be involved in this space, I think that is an environment in which some of the types of actors that today we have routinely thought of as less important, as less sophisticated, as unlikely to cause real damage, people who are referred to as kind of script kiddies, or the types of hacktivists in the past who may have done simple website defacements. In the future, those groups could be far more damaging. And I think if you combine that with where we are geopolitically, with far more polarization around the world, around issues that can cause real acts of violence, those are the kind of groups that could very easily get upskilled, don't need to have a strong monetary incentive and actual money to actually pay for real high level capability, don't have the backing of a nation state behind them. They could become the real threats for the future. I mean, I think back to a lot of work that I was involved in when I was in the government, and we were looking at potential future risks from terror organizations, the Hamas's, the Hezbollah, the ISIS. There were very few terrorists around the world who had world-class cybersecurity capabilities. There were some associated with the Syrian Electronic Army and ISIS for a while, and they were the subject of real targeting by the United States and other Western governments. But if that same environment had been infused with the kind of AI capabilities that are now becoming much more prevalent and much more accessible to those individuals, the potential risks that could have been posed to critical infrastructure in the West and for our allies overseas could have been substantially different. And so that is one of those risks that that my team in particular is looking out for in the future. How does this development? Do we start to see real changes in individuals who might have political motivations to disrupt companies that are involved in things that they don't support politically, in ways that we've not seen beyond kind of the more simple defacements and the like. Now, when I used to think about AI when I was still in government, my general answer was AI on the defense is working far better than our adversaries are able to exploit it. We have been able, as a country, and frankly, many of our partners and allies overseas, to utilize the benefits of AI to dramatically improve our ability to detect, stop, and respond to incidents. And we were doing that at a far faster pace than our adversaries were weaponizing it. And I think there were some good reasons for that. I mean, if you think about the monetary incentive companies like SentinelOne and our competitors, but also the fact that many companies like ours had already been using, let's say, pre-AI statistical tools, machine learning, neural networks, et cetera, already part of the suite of capabilities that we were using to better understand how we can improve cybersecurity, to develop behavioral analytics, to be able to detect anomalous activity on networks. So we already were starting from a high level of base of understanding how do you take technology like this and integrate it into cyber defenses. And today, that is accelerating even with things like how do you improve the human-machine interactions in SOCs? How do you automate more activities so that humans can focus on the things that they do better, more creative work, as opposed to running down every single level one tier one alerts you have in a SOC. So that is happening, and that will continue to increase. But my sense is that over the past 18 months, we have seen a continued narrowing of the gap between the attackers and the defenders in this space. We had a huge advantage, and we were building it into our systems. But at some point, we're going to be in more of an equilibrium, where attackers will have advantages, and they'll be able to build those in, and they'll be able to move as quickly as we can in terms of moving ahead. I think it's a matter of we need to make sure that we spend as much time as we can getting that gap, keeping that gap as far apart as we can. And that means looking for new and creative ways to utilize AI. It means securing the AI infrastructure that companies are using. And SentinelOne has made a series of recent acquisitions that are really designed around that question. How do we help protect our customers that are using AI for their operations and give them confidence that they can actually get the kinds of productivity and economic benefits out of these tools that they want and minimize the risks? And our competitors are doing very much the same things. And it's all a matter of how can we make sure that we stay ahead for as long as possible, knowing that might come to an end. And I think importantly here is it's not just a matter of just the big companies that could benefit from this. I think that has been a huge challenge, and I'll talk about this kind of towards the end, in that if AI's benefits only accrue to a small number of companies that could actually embed this in their technology, we will maintain as a country a high level of risk. If local municipal water utilities can't benefit from AI-enabled cyber defense, those risks will be untenable. And so part of, I think, what our challenge is not only do we keep ahead, but how do we make sure we continue to get this technology into the hands of cyber defenders wherever they are, down to the small communities, down to the small and medium-sized businesses, which are the ones today that have really been the most ravaged by things like ransomware, because this is a challenge that we've not yet figured out how to meet. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to kind of what's happening more globally, more in some of the geopolitics of the situation and in the policy landscape that is influencing some of these decisions. I continue to believe that when it comes to defensive cybersecurity policy, you're actually going to see a fair amount of continuity between the previous administration and the current administration. Current administration did not get rid of all of the cyber regulations which were coming out over the past 6 months that they could have potentially stopped, focused on cybersecurity. There was a DOJ data security regulation that came out in April. There was a Coast Guard regulation related to maritime cybersecurity that was able to continue. And I think the overall focus of the White House in the cybersecurity space on offensive cybersecurity is generally going to mean that defensive cybersecurity activities will be more in the hands of individual departments and agencies, which will tend to lead to a bit more continuity than I think most people would expect. But there are some areas where they want to take a bit of a different approach than the previous administration, and I think it'll have real implications for how we think about AI. And some of these are exacerbating trends that were already underway and that are not just confined to the US. So let's say AI dominance. One area where the Trump administration came in pretty strong was removing the Biden administration's executive order on AI that kind of attempted to balance more between AI advancement and managing the downside risks of AI. I think the Trump administration has been far more clear that the goal is that AI will be developed, and we need to ensure that it happens inside the United States, that we continue to lead in this space. But the reason why I said that I think in some cases this is less a US issue and more of a global issue, I think if you look at these same exact issues in Europe, you will not see a whole lot of difference. So not too long, maybe like 6 months after ChatGPT was first released, and the huge focus across the planet around AI, there was a major AI safety summit held at Bletchley Park where the US and our British counterparts broke the German codes. And it was all focused on AI safety. What are we doing to secure it? I think if you listen to European policymakers today, the discussion around AI safety is almost non-existent, to the point where there's a lot of discussion in Europe about whether postponing or potentially even making substantial changes in the EU's AI regulation is what's happening. And you're seeing far more conversations around competitiveness, AI dominance coming out of Europe. People that had spent the previous 2 years focused entirely on AI safety and security. I think that is a reflection of broader trends that are happening in Europe related to concerns around competitiveness globally, and not wanting to watch another case where the technology is dominated by the United States and China, and Europe basically just has to choose between the two. You're also seeing this in some respects with efforts by Europe to build sovereign cloud zones, including from EU companies, and not rely exclusively on US hyperscalers to be their cloud of choice. So I would say, again, this, the focus on AI dominance, from a practical perspective, will mean likely less regulations on AI, more capabilities more quickly. It doesn't change the fundamentals that I discussed earlier, which is those capabilities can be used for good and evil. And we in the cybersecurity community need to figure out both how we're securing it, how we're defending it, and how we are utilizing it to the maximum extent that we can. And the second piece is on, as I mentioned, the Trump administration has a huge focus now on improving our kind of offensive cybersecurity strategy. There's a belief that there has been an underutilization of offense to both deter and disrupt cyber activity from malicious actors, both nation states and criminal organizations. And I think that there is a lot of validity to that. Now, again, there's also a lot of complexity. Conducting effective cyber operations is not easy, and there's a lot of trade-offs, and there's a lot of complexity with how you do that and how you assure you're achieving a certain level of effect and not unduly affecting third parties, since surprise, surprise, adversaries don't generally conduct the operations directly off their host machines. They're operating it off of off of usually compromised infrastructure or purchased and leased infrastructure, typically in the West. So just as one example, when you look back at the Volt Typhoon activity, so this was Chinese, likely PLA military activity to pre-position on US critical infrastructure, water systems, electric power systems throughout the United States. All of those operations were conducted through small and home office routers that had been compromised by the Chinese. So when that piece of critical infrastructure looked for a return address on the compromises, they could show up in your living room or a small business closet where they kept their Spectrum provided Netgear router that had been compromised by the Chinese. But this, I think, is going to be a reality, and I think people need to kind of understand what this might mean. It might make the cyberspace a bit more crowded, with more offensive activity happening in both directions. And I think we will have to see in terms of its actual implications on long-term risks in this space. But I kind of started, I mentioned at the beginning, I kind of wanted to end this with a conversation around what's happening here. When I look at the cyber landscape, and I'd spent my career trying to understand how do we protect U.S. critical infrastructure. We define that very broadly in our government. People think that technology happens in Silicon Valley and in Austin. But cybersecurity needs to happen everywhere. Every water utility needs to be cyber secure because they're relying upon internet-connected OT devices to manage their network. Every power utility, every manufacturing plant, which manufacturing facilities tend to be the #1 target of ransomware groups. Every local community, every police department, every fire department, all of them need cybersecurity. And that is not going to happen unless there are more places like this that are helping to kind of build local cyber talent that can go directly into the community and provide the level of support that they need. I was a huge proponent when I was in government that every company should have a partnership with a local college, community college, trade school to create a feed from their programs directly into SOCs and security teams at these companies. You need that relationship because if you're just relying upon broad job announcements, and you're just relying upon, and you're not helping to invest in that long-term development of a workforce that can provide the level of support that you need, you're always going to be missing it. And so this is where I think, when you think about some of the stats that you hear out there about the huge number of cybersecurity jobs that are vacant at the same time, and people have a hard time finding, while at the same time people are struggling to find jobs, is everyone is competing for those same jobs at big technology companies. They are not competing for those jobs at a rural water utility who has just as much need for a level 1 or 2 or 3 SOC analyst to make sure that they can respond appropriately to the alerts that their systems are throwing off, that they can work on building in the next generation of cybersecurity into that company or that utility. And so capabilities like this, where you're helping to kind of build and sustain a workforce that can continue to meet the needs, is incredibly important. And to focus on the topic of the conversation, my hope is that we are using AI to fill some of those gaps. And that, I think this is a place where SentinelOne is eating its own dog food, or I think my old boss liked to say drinking its own champagne. In the SentinelOne SOC today, we are using AI to automate most of the tier 1 alerts. They are audited by a person, but they are handled by the hyper-automation systems that SentinelOne is deploying for its customers. We have that level of confidence that we're using it as a key part of our security architecture. And I think it will help from both a workforce development perspective as more people get trained on these kinds of tools, be able to use them effectively in the workplace. And two, that when you get in the workplace, you not only have these tools, but it allows you to do things that a machine can never do. And that is going to be kind of the creative thought of thinking through security in a more challenging way, predicting what adversaries might do, getting ahead of them, and tackling those harder problems that the AGI may in the future get to, but I think is a long way off from where we are today. So really, super impressed with what's happening here at Bridgewater State, and the kind of model that you are setting for the rest of the country for how to build a workforce that we need. So with that, I will stop there. I'm happy to kind of take some questions on what I talked about or kind of other issues affecting geopolitics and technology. Thank you. The network enumeration, kind of looking for vulnerable hosts and servers out there, conducting kind of initial compromise. That is some of the ways in which adversaries are using AI today. It is a speed and scale issue. When you think about a typical ransomware operator who'd be the one most likely to target your small local communities, they're going to have either themselves or they're going to go through a data access broker who's going to try to get as much access as possible to as many different hosts and workstations as possible, and then take that, maybe sell them or then filter out, okay, which ones do I actually want to spend time on? And I think AI is both going to help expand the number that's hit at the beginning by able to kind of automate attacks at a bigger scale. Second, it'll be able to let them go through those compromised entities to look for which ones may be most susceptible for effective follow-on activities, which ones may have flatter networks that will allow them to move laterally more easily, or they're easier connections to domain controllers, et cetera. So that'll be kind of key parts of the kind of AI-enabled part of the attack chain that do not require very sophisticated level of capabilities. It is a modest change over what criminal organizations have demonstrated a capability to do today, but it could very easily kind of overwhelm us on the defensive side, because remediating that, even if we knew of every single one of those compromised entities, the remediation alone is a burden and needs to be done by hand in a careful way to make sure that the infection hadn't spread, et cetera. And this was something that we dealt with in government. So we had created a program called the Free Ransomware Notification Initiative. So this is where security researchers out there who had access to malicious actor infrastructure could see where they had connections but had not yet executed a full ransomware attack. They didn't have the ability to actually notify whoever a random IP address was, so they'd give it over to us, and then when I was in government, CISA would go and then work with the FBI, or directly we'd go let the entity know, hey, you have a compromised host, here's the information, you need to go remediate that because they've not yet conducted an attack. We had some high profile ones. I'm actually forgetting now, it is one of the credit bureaus. I want to say Equifax, but it might have been one of the other ones. Actually came out publicly and talked about that they had gotten a call from us and had actually were able to remediate that host before they actually had a ransomware incident, and thanked us. But when I left, we had been running the program for about 18 months, and we had conducted somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 2,500 notifications in that window. And again, we were not realistically doing a dent in the ransomware challenges that we have. So just imagine if those are turbocharged by AI improving speed and scale of the adversary execution in that space, it could be an even worse day. And so that's where, if we're just relying upon those folks, who may not have an MDR provider like CyberTrust carefully monitoring their network, they have probably some relatively inexpensive antivirus on the system, maybe at best. Those entities are just ripe for the picking. it goes without saying that long-term development of AI tools require a degree of energy production that we do not have today. And so when we talk about AI dominance, it literally requires energy dominance. And the statistics on the amount of additional gigawatts of power that China, for example, is adding to their grid every year because of what they believe will be their long-term needs to sustain technology development, both in AI and in other related fields like quantum, et cetera, are enormous and far outstripping what we're able to do. And I think this is very much at the center of a number of the initiatives that the Trump administration has tried to execute on, including things like permitting for transmission, et cetera, which has tended to be one of the big bottlenecks. The other being the production of the actual turbines for production. Even if we wanted to add much more natural gas powered turbines in this country, which we have natural gas in abundance, so would be the most cost efficient for us. We cannot literally buy the turbines because the factories that build those turbines are already committed for probably the next 5 years. So even if you bought one today, it would show up sometime in the 2030s. So this is going to be a huge, huge challenge. And I think it is the reason why you're seeing companies like Microsoft and Google looking to make investments in small modular nuclear reactors and others. It is because we need to find creative solutions to this problem, because we can't deal with it, messing around with kilowatt hours here and there when you need gigawatt hours to achieve our goals in AI. So I think we as a country have not yet grappled with how we're going to handle that, the competitive trade-off that will eventually occur between data center needs for energy and other parts of the economy. Are we willing to sustain rolling brownouts in areas in order to achieve our AI goals? Those could be the questions we have to grapple with in the future. Yeah, no, it is a good question, and I'd say it is one that the government, both the executive branch and Congress, has grappled with. How should the government think about regulation in cyberspace? I think you have seen the government kind of chip away at this problem where it's had existing authority, or where it could easily use existing authority to put in place certain minimum standards. So not necessarily minimum spend, but minimum requirements. You need to do a certain series of things and demonstrate that you are more secure, and that is kind of embodied in some of the regulations in the transportation sector that TSA did in the wake of Colonial Pipeline on both pipelines, airlines, airports, and rail operators. We've had regulations in the energy space for parts of the bulk power system, so major transmission operators, not necessarily every single small utility, but the ones that are really key to enabling the bulk power operations across the country. They've had minimum cybersecurity standards that have been in place through the North American Energy Reliability Corporation, NERC, for the past 15 years, and they've continued to update those. But what you don't have is kind of minimum standards that apply to everyone. So it tends to be very, very narrowly sector specific. And I didn't even touch upon, obviously, a lot of financial sector regulations that are coming from places like the Fed and the SEC and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, all of which have separate examiners climbing up and down various financial institutions. But there is nothing that applies to communities and water utilities and manufacturing facilities and hospitals. There are no minimum standards. The government has looked at this a number of times. One of the biggest areas of probably divergence between what the Biden administration was pushing for and what you're seeing from the Trump administration is the Biden administration, at least as part of their national cyber strategy, called for minimum standards across all critical infrastructure sectors. Now, Congress was not going to go along with that, so it never went anywhere, but that was at least the stated goal and desired outcome from the administration. It's not, I don't believe that the administration will carry that forward. But you do occasionally see kind of this issue come up in Congress with a desire, particularly after you hear things like Salt Typhoon compromise of communication providers. Can Congress take some action to affect water, hospitals, communications, et cetera, that may lack very consistent regulations? I think, unfortunately, it may require, an incident before we are willing, as a country, to put in place those levels of regulation that today, we don't have. But I don't see any kind of political appetite in the short term for something like that. But I'd say just one additional point on that. I mean, I think it does require money. I think the government has tried in other ways to kind of help. So it had a state and local cybersecurity grant program in order to give money to states. States could use that to provide certain services, in some cases shared services, to smaller communities that couldn't do it themselves. That doesn't obviously help non-public entities, but it's a start. That grant that grant program is ending this year, but I think the good news is the administration supports continuing it potentially at a lower funding level. The other thing to look at is where states may be putting their own regulations into place. Again, these tend to be more narrowly tailored, but the New York Department of Financial Services has some of their own cyber regulations on financial entities operating in New York. Now, again, it's one city, one small area, but I do think it is potentially demonstrative of what states could do if they wanted to begin to kind of move the ball forward for entities that operate within their jurisdiction. So this doesn't foreclose future opportunities, but it does mean that it's going to be a little bit harder and more longer term before we get to the type of baseline of cybersecurity that everyone has. And then I'll just add, I think this is a problem that I grappled with a lot when I was in government, and was really a struggle because there's no good way to ensure that everyone who has the level of cybersecurity that has what they need. Now, I think it is certainly true today that the vast majority of companies in small communities should not be operating their own computer networks, period. Cybersecurity today is not an amateur sport. This should be done by professionals who have the ability to operate at a speed and scale that you cannot do as an army of one. And so we need to think through, okay, how do we create mechanisms to make this as easy and cost efficient as possible for someone to gain access to that expertise? Because it is hiring one cybersecurity person for one facility and you're it. You're outnumbered, you're outgunned. And no matter how good you are, you're probably not enough. And so how do we get small communities into capabilities like cyber trust, like the MSI stack? I mean, there's lots of capabilities out there that are designed to kind of provide that level of professionalism to cybersecurity and give you scale and heft, the ability to recruit a certain level of talent that just doesn't happen if you're hiring these one at a time for small businesses and local communities. It's just not an amateur sport today, and you're going to lose.